We are about to look at a war fought entirely over a wooden bucket, a submarine that was sunk by its own toilet, and a $20 million spy cat that got hit by a taxi in 5 minutes. If you think the world is crazy now, just wait until you see the absolute chaos of the past. This is a speed run of the worst decisions ever made by leaders, armies, and inventors. Here are 33 dumbest history facts that make absolutely no sense. 1. If you think modern sports scandals are wild, they have nothing on the absolute fever dream that was the 1904 Olympic Marathon in St. Louis. This wasn't a race, it was a carnival of suffering where the organizers intentionally withheld water to test purposeful dehydration in 90-degree heat. The course was just dusty roads full of traffic, which caused one runner to suffer a lung hemorrhage from the dust clouds. The winner, Thomas Hicks, was literally carried across the finish line by his trainers while hallucinating because they had been feeding him a mixture of brandy, raw eggs, and actual rat poison as a stimulant. Another runner was chased a mile off course by a pack of feral dogs. And the guy who finished fourth? He was a Cuban postman who ran in dress shoes and took a nap in the middle of the race because he ate some rotten apples. It remains the stupidest sporting event in human history. 2. Dictators usually want nuclear weapons or giant statues, but Fidel Castro was obsessed with creating the ultimate dairy product to a weirdly personal degree. He decided to breed a super cow named Ubre Blanca that could outproduce American cattle, and he treated this animal better than most of his citizens. She lived in a climate-controlled room with armed guards to prevent assassination attempts, while a team of scientists monitored her every move. Castro even arranged for soothing music to be played daily to keep her stress levels down, and reportedly visited her just to chat. When she eventually died, she was given full military honors, a statue, and her taxidermied body was put in a glass box in a museum. All of this effort, money, and national pride was invested just because one guy really loved a glass of milk. 3. World War II. German U-boats were terrifying machines of destruction, but the U-1206 was defeated by its own over-engineered plumbing. In 1945, this submarine was equipped with a new, high-tech deep-sea toilet that allowed the crew to flush while submerged, but the system was so complicated that you needed a special training course just to use the bathroom. The captain, apparently skipping the manual, used the facilities and turned the wrong valve. Instead of flushing the waste out, he unleashed a high-pressure torrent of seawater and sewage back into the sub. The water flooded the batteries beneath the floorboards, creating deadly chlorine gas. The captain had no choice but to surface the boat right off the coast of Scotland, where they were immediately spotted and bombed by Allied patrols. Yes, a highly advanced warship was lost forever because the captain could not handle the toilet. 4. War is usually tragic, bloody, and horrific, but the tiny nation of Liechtenstein apparently didn't get the memo during the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. They sent out an army of 80 men to guard a mountain pass with instructions to basically stand there and look tough. They avoided any actual combat, probably spent most of their time enjoying the scenery, and when the war ended, they marched back home. But here is the best part. They left with 80 men, but they returned with 81. It turns out they had made a friend along the way, an Austrian liaison officer or maybe just an Italian guy who liked their vibe. And he decided to join them. It is the only recorded military campaign in history that resulted in negative casualties. They literally made a profit on friendship during a war, which is the kind of wholesome incompetence we need more of. 5. During the height of the Cold War, the CIA was desperate for new ways to spy on the Soviets, and instead of better microphones, some genius decided the answer was Operation Acoustic Kitty. They spent 5 years and $20 million essentially trying to turn a cat into a cyborg. Surgeons implanted a microphone into a cat's ear canal and a radio transmitter at the base of its skull, thinking they could train the animal to sit near Soviet agents on park benches and record their conversations. On the very first field test, they drove the multi-million-dollar spy cat to a park, opened the van door, and released it to do its job. The cat immediately wandered into the street and was hit by a taxi, dying instantly. The project was canceled shortly after, proving that you cannot force a cat to do anything, even for $20 million. 6. We all have that one friend who does stupid things when they are drunk, but nobody tops a man named Thomas Fitzpatrick. In 1956, this New Jersey resident was drinking at a bar in New York City and made a bet that he could travel from New Jersey to the bar in 15 minutes. To prove it, he drove to a local airfield, stole a single-engine plane at 3 in the morning, flew it without lights or radio, and landed it perfectly on the narrow street right in front of the bar. The police were impressed but still fined him. 2 years later, he was at a bar again, and a customer refused to believe the story. So naturally, Thomas did the hold my beer move, stole another plane, and did the exact same thing again just to prove a point. He is the patron saint of bad decisions and excellent piloting skills. 7. If you think modern politics is toxic, you should check out the Cadaver Synod of the 9th century, which was easily the most macabre courtroom drama ever. Pope Stephen VI hated his predecessor, Pope Formosus, so much that he decided death wasn't a good enough reason to stop suing him. Stephen ordered Formosus's 9-month-old rotting corpse to be dug up, dressed in full papal vestments, and propped up on a throne to stand trial. A deacon was assigned to stand behind the corpse and answer for him, while Pope Stephen screamed questions at the skeleton. Unsurprisingly, the corpse was found guilty of perjury. As punishment, they cut off his 3 fingers used for blessings, stripped off his robes, and threw the body into the river. It was a level of petty revenge that makes today's politicians look like best friends. 8. History is full of wars fought over land, religion, or resources, but in 1325, 2 Italian city-states went to war over a bucket. The War of the Oaken Bucket started when soldiers from Modena snuck into the center of Bologna and stole a wooden bucket used to draw water from the main well. The Bolognese were so humiliated that they demanded it back, and when Modena refused, Bologna mobilized a massive army. The ensuing battle involved thousands of soldiers and resulted in 2,000 deaths, which is a lot of carnage for a piece of gardening equipment. Modena won the battle, kept the bucket, and they still have it today. It is displayed in the bell tower of the cathedral in Modena, mocking Bologna almost 700 years later. Imagine dying because someone stole a pail. 9. If you think the 50s were a safer, simpler time, just remember that parents used to radiate their children's feet for fun at the local shoe store. It was called the shoe-fitting fluoroscope, a wooden box found in high-end shops that blasted X-rays through your feet so you could see the bones wiggle inside your new loafers. It was marketed as a scientific way to ensure a perfect fit, but in reality, it was just a gimmick that exposed kids and salesmen to dangerous levels of radiation. Children would play on these machines for 20 minutes at a time while their moms shopped, completely unaware they were cooking their toes. The result was a generation of people with radiation burns, stunted foot growth, and increased cancer risks, all because society collectively decided that trying on shoes the normal way was just too boring without a dose of ionizing radiation. 10. Australia is known for its deadly animals, but the only time the government officially declared war on wildlife, they lost to a flightless bird. In 1932, the Australian military launched the Great Emu War to stop 20,000 emus from destroying crops. They sent Major Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery armed with Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, expecting an easy victory. But the emus were tactical geniuses. They scattered in small groups to avoid machine gun fire, used guerrilla tactics, and basically dodged bullets like they were in the Matrix. After weeks of embarrassing failure and jamming guns, the military withdrew. The official report noted that despite thousands of rounds fired, the vast majority of the birds were completely fine. The government had to admit defeat, marking the only time in history a modern army surrendered to a flock of oversized chickens. 11. In 1986, the city of Cleveland decided to shed its rusty reputation by setting a world record, but instead, they created an ecological apocalypse. The plan was Balloon Fest, where they released 1.5 million helium balloons into the sky simultaneously. It looked spectacular for about 30 seconds until a cold front hit, pushing the massive cloud of latex back down onto the city and Lake Erie. The balloons clogged the airport runway, caused car accidents by blinding drivers, and terrified racehorses. Tragically, the Coast Guard was searching for 2 missing fishermen on the lake, but the water was covered in thousands of colorful balloons that looked exactly like human heads bobbing in the waves. The rescue team couldn't find the men in the chaos, and the city faced millions in lawsuits for what was supposed to be a fun charity event. 12. You have heard of military operations to topple governments, but Operation Paul Bunyan was a massive deployment of U.S. military might just to trim a single tree. In 1976, inside the Korean demilitarized zone, a poplar tree was blocking the view of United Nations observers. When American soldiers tried to trim it, they were attacked by North Korean guards. In response, the U.S. didn't back down. They went completely overboard. 3 days later, they returned with a convoy of 27 helicopters, B-52 nuclear-capable bombers circling overhead, F-111 fighter jets, an aircraft carrier battle group offshore, and hundreds of combat-ready troops. All of this firepower was assembled just so a few engineers with chainsaws could cut down one tree while the North Koreans watched in silence. It remains the most expensive and intimidating landscaping project in the history of the universe. 13. Psychological warfare usually involves propaganda or fear, but the ancient Persians conquered Egypt by weaponizing pure cuteness. During the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BC, the Persian king Cambyses II knew that the Egyptians worshipped cats as the sacred representation of the goddess Bastet. So he ordered his soldiers to paint images of cats on their shields and, according to some accounts, even carry live cats into the front lines. The Egyptian archers were so terrified of accidentally hurting a sacred feline and angering a goddess that they refused to shoot their arrows. They essentially froze, allowing the Persians to march right up and slaughter them. The Egyptians loved their pets so much that they literally let their entire kingdom fall rather than risk injuring a fluffy kitty, which honestly is a level of dedication cat owners today can relate to. 14. Long before fake news on the internet, people were just as gullible when reading newspapers. In 1835, the New York Sun published a series of articles claiming that a famous astronomer had built a super telescope and discovered life on the moon. But this wasn't just bacteria. The articles described distinct civilizations of blue-skinned humanoids, unicorns, and, I am serious, bipedal beavers that walked on 2 legs and built huts with chimneys. The public went absolutely insane for it. The newspaper circulation skyrocketed, and people were discussing the moon beavers as scientific fact for weeks. Even when it was revealed to be a total hoax, the newspaper didn't even really apologize, and the public didn't seem to care that they had been duped. It proved early on that if a story is entertaining enough, people will believe literally anything. 15. There are weird diets. And then there is August Engelhardt, a German nudist who started a cult based entirely on coconuts. In the early 1900s, he bought an island in the Pacific and founded the Order of the Sun, preaching that the coconut was the holy fruit of God because it grew high up near the sun. He believed that by eating only coconuts, humans would become immortal and godlike. He managed to convince a handful of followers to join him, where they spent their days naked, eating nothing but coconut meat and drinking coconut water. Unsurprisingly, instead of becoming immortal gods, they all started dying of malnutrition and severe sunburns. Engelhardt himself wasted away to 66 pounds and was found mentally unstable, proving that while coconuts are tasty, you probably need a bit more than tropical fruit to transcend humanity. 16. Napoleon Bonaparte is remembered as one of the greatest military strategists in history, a man who conquered Europe and redrew maps. But he was once forced to flee in terror from a horde of bunnies. To celebrate the Treaty of Tilsit, his chief of staff organized a rabbit hunt and bought roughly 3,000 rabbits for the occasion. However, instead of buying wild hares, he bought tame farm rabbits who didn't fear humans. When the rabbits were released, they didn't run away. They saw Napoleon and thought, "Hey, that is the guy who brings the lettuce." Thousands of fluffy bunnies swarmed the emperor, climbing up his legs and jacket. Napoleon tried to shoo them away, but they were relentless. The great conqueror had to run to his carriage and lock himself inside while the rabbits reportedly chewed through his troops' lines. It was his most fluffy and humiliating defeat. 17. NASA employs the smartest people on Earth, literal rocket scientists. Yet in 1999 they lost the Mars Climate Orbiter because they forgot to check their units. One team of engineers at Lockheed Martin wrote the navigation software using imperial units, like pounds and inches, while the team at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory used the metric system, like newtons and meters. Because nobody caught this basic math class error, the spacecraft approached Mars, got confused by the data, and smashed directly into the planet's atmosphere, burning up instantly. It was a $327 million disaster caused by the kind of mistake you make on a high school physics quiz. It is comforting to know that even guys who build spaceships sometimes forget how to convert inches to centimeters. 18. In 1875, a massive fire broke out in a Dublin whiskey warehouse, but instead of smoke and ash, the streets were flooded with a literal river of burning alcohol. 5,000 barrels burst open, sending a 6-inch deep tide of flaming booze flowing through the city lanes. Now, you might expect people to run for their lives. But this was Dublin. Instead of evacuating, crowds of people grabbed pots, hats, and even their own boots to scoop up the free whiskey flowing in the gutters. The tragedy is that 13 people died, but not a single one perished from the fire or smoke. Every single casualty was caused by alcohol poisoning because they drank the burning, dirty street whiskey until they dropped dead. It is perhaps the most Irish tragedy ever recorded. 19. The British government in India tried to solve a cobra problem using capitalism, and it backfired so hard it became a legitimate economic term. They were worried about the number of venomous snakes in Delhi, so they offered a cash bounty for every dead cobra turned in. It seemed like a smart plan until the locals realized they could just breed cobras in their backyards to make easy money. The city was soon filled with secret snake farms. When the British realized they were paying for farm-raised snakes, they canceled the program. The angry farmers, now stuck with thousands of worthless snakes, simply released them all into the streets. The result was that the cobra population tripled. The British took a bad situation, paid for it, and successfully made it infinitely worse. 20. In 1859, a failed businessman named Joshua Norton lost his mind and simply declared himself Emperor of the United States. In any other city, he would be institutionalized, but San Francisco just shrugged and said, "Sure, why not?" He wore a ragged uniform with gold epaulets, inspected the streets, and issued proclamations dissolving Congress, which, honestly, is a mood. The amazing part is that the city played along for 21 years. Restaurants gave him free meals, theaters saved him seats, and the police officers saluted him as he passed. He even printed his own currency, which local shops actually accepted as legal tender. When he died, 30,000 people attended his funeral. He remains the only monarch in American history, proving that confidence is literally the only thing you need to succeed. 21. We all know sports fans can get aggressive, but in 1969, El Salvador and Honduras took it to a psychotic level by starting a literal war over a soccer match. Tensions were already high between the nations due to immigration issues, but the breaking point was a series of World Cup qualifying matches where fans beat each other up. Following the riots, the Salvadoran army launched an invasion, bombing Honduran airports and marching troops across the border. This became known as the Football War. It lasted 100 hours, involved actual fighter jets dogfighting in the sky, and resulted in thousands of casualties. It is officially the only time in human history where a referee's bad call could have arguably been classified as a catalyst for a war crime. 22. In the late 1800s, a railway signalman in South Africa named James Wide lost his legs in an accident, so naturally, he hired a baboon named Jack to do his job for him. This is not a joke. Jack was officially employed by the railroad to operate the heavy levers that switched tracks based on the whistle counts from approaching trains. The railway authorities were skeptical until they saw Jack working perfectly. He was put on the payroll and received 20 cents a day and half a bottle of beer every week as his salary. Jack worked for 9 years and, unlike most human employees, he never made a single mistake. He died of tuberculosis, leaving behind a legacy as the most competent beer-drinking monkey in railroad history. 23. Before the 18th century, the French were terrified of potatoes, believing they caused leprosy and were fit only for pigs. In fact, they were actually illegal to grow in France for a while. Enter Antoine-Augustin Parmentier, a genius who understood human nature better than agriculture. He convinced the king to let him plant a field of potatoes and stationed heavily armed royal guards around it during the day. This made the peasants think that if the king was guarding them, they must be valuable gold. Parmentier then intentionally ordered the guards to leave at night. The locals immediately snuck in, stole the precious tubers, and started eating them. He tricked an entire nation into eating French fries using nothing but reverse psychology and fake security. 24. After World War I, France decided they never wanted to be invaded again, so they spent a fortune building the Maginot Line. It was an impregnable wall of concrete bunkers, tunnels, retractable turrets, and air-conditioned barracks stretching along the German border. It was a technological marvel that could stop any army. The only problem? The wall stopped abruptly at the Belgian border because the French thought the Ardennes forest was too thick for tanks to pass through. When World War II started, the Germans looked at the scary wall, looked at the forest, and said, "Let's just drive through the trees." They bypassed the entire Maginot Line in days, rendering the most expensive defensive structure in history completely useless without firing a single shot at it. 25. If you think today's weather forecasts are unreliable, be glad you weren't in Kentucky in 1876 during the Great Meat Shower. On a perfectly clear, sunny day, chunks of raw red meat started falling from the sky over a farm in Olympia Springs. It wasn't a sprinkle. It rained meat for several minutes, covering fences and the ground in beef-like slabs. But the truly dumb part isn't the mystery, it's the reaction. Instead of running inside or calling a priest, 2 local men decided the scientific method required them to eat the sky meat. They cooked it, tasted it, and declared it to be either venison or mutton. Later analysis suggested it was likely vomit ejected by a passing flock of vultures mid-flight, meaning those brave taste testers voluntarily ate regurgitated buzzard lunch. 26. Marketing scares are nothing new, but in 19th century Prague, a rumor spread that was so terrifying it literally stopped people from going to the bathroom. The story went around that a deadly species of sewer snake had invaded the city's plumbing and was waiting in the pipes to bite people on their backsides while they were vulnerable. Panic swept the city, and people began refusing to use indoor toilets, reverting to medieval hygiene standards. It turned out there were no snakes. The entire hysteria was fabricated by an enterprising salesman who sold portable chamber pots. He started the rumor just to boost his sales, effectively terrifying an entire major European city into pooping in buckets again just to make a quick profit. 27. Rock, paper, scissors has clear rules, and usually ship beats horse, but the Battle of Texel in 1795 is the only time in history where cavalry captured a naval fleet. During the French Revolutionary Wars, a French cavalry regiment saw the Dutch fleet anchored near the island of Texel. The winter was so severe that the ocean had frozen solid, trapping the mighty warships in thick ice. Seeing the absurdity of the situation, the French general ordered his men to wrap cloth around their horses' hooves to muffle the sound and simply gallop across the frozen sea. The Dutch sailors, who were expecting a naval battle, were fast asleep when they were surrounded by men on horses pointing swords at them. They surrendered without a fight, proving that nature is the ultimate wild card. 28. In the late 19th century, women started riding bicycles to gain freedom of movement, and Victorian doctors, being the pillars of wisdom they were, immediately invented a fake disease to stop them. They warned women about bicycle face, a terrifying condition caused by the strain of keeping balance. Doctors claimed that the bicycle stare would cause a woman's eyes to bulge out, her jaw to clench permanently, and her face to become pale and haggard, ruining her chances of marriage. It was obviously total nonsense designed to scare women back into the kitchen. But for years, medical journals published serious articles warning that a nice afternoon ride would turn you into a wide-eyed goblin. 29. We usually think of the Industrial Revolution as starting in the 1700s, but humanity actually invented the steam engine in the 1st century AD and then just ignored it. Hero of Alexandria, a Greek engineer, built the Aeolipile, a metal sphere that spun rapidly using steam power, basically a working steam engine. But instead of realizing they could use this to power looms, carts, or ships and jumpstart the future by 1700 years, the Greeks just looked at it and said, "Cool toy, bro." They used it to open temple doors automatically or just as a party trick for rich people. Because they had cheap slave labor, nobody felt the need to automate anything, so one of history's greatest inventions sat on a shelf gathering dust for millennia. 30. Draco was an ancient Greek legislator whose laws were so harsh that we still use the word draconian today. But he didn't die from an assassination or a revolt. He died from being too popular. According to legend, he was visiting the theater on the island of Aegina to be honored by his supporters. In ancient Greece, the traditional way to show approval wasn't clapping, but throwing your hats and cloaks at the person. Unfortunately, the crowd loved him a little too much. They threw so many heavy wool cloaks and tunics onto him that he was buried underneath the pile. By the time they dug him out, the great lawmaker had suffocated to death. He is the only politician in history to be literally killed by the overwhelming support of his voters. 31. Before we had crypto scams and NFTs, we had the Dutch tulip mania of 1637, which remains the stupidest financial bubble in history. For some reason, the Dutch collectively decided that tulip bulbs were the most valuable objects on Earth. At the height of the frenzy, a single bulb of a rare tulip could cost the same as a luxury mansion on the Amsterdam Grand Canal. People sold their land, their life savings, and their livestock just to buy a flower that would die in a week. Contracts were traded for bulbs that hadn't even grown yet. Inevitably, someone woke up and realized, wait, it is just a flower, and the market crashed overnight. Thousands were left bankrupt, holding worthless gardening supplies instead of retirement funds. 32. The defenestration of Prague sounds like a fancy diplomatic event, but it literally translates to the throwing of someone out of a window. In 1618, Protestant rebels stormed the castle in Prague and seized 3 Catholic officials. Instead of executing them, they tossed them out of a 3rd-story window, a drop of about 70 feet. Miraculously, all 3 men survived the fall without serious injury. The Catholic Church immediately claimed that they were saved by angels who gently lowered them to the ground. The Protestants, however, pointed out the more smelly reality. They survived because they landed in a massive, soft pile of horse manure that had accumulated in the moat. This event, quite literally starting a war over a pile of poop, kicked off the 30 Years' War. 33. When nations want to secure a border, they usually build a wall of stone or steel. But the British Empire and India decided to do some extreme gardening. In the 19th century, to prevent people from smuggling salt without paying taxes, they created the Inland Customs Line, which was basically a giant hedge. This wasn't a small garden feature. It was a 4,000-kilometer-long barrier of thorny trees and bushes stretching across the entire subcontinent. It was impenetrable and manned by 12,000 officers whose sole job was to patrol a shrubbery. It was longer than the US-Mexico border and stood for decades, proving that the British were so obsessed with tax revenue that they literally divided a massive country with a really tall bush just to make sure nobody seasoned their dinner for free. That was a massive amount of stupidity, but let's be real. Human history is basically an infinite supply of bad ideas, so I definitely missed some huge ones. Now it is your turn to outsmart me. Go to the comments and tell me, what is the single dumbest, weirdest, or most absurd historical fact that should have been on this list but wasn't? If your fact is good enough, it might just make it into part 2. Hit subscribe if you learned something new, and I will see you in the next one.